Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this DMU research webinar marking the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. Our session this afternoon is titled Slavery from the Global to the Local and from the Historical to the Modern. My name's Jonathan Davies, and I'm the Professor of Critical Policy Studies and Director of the Centre for Urban Research on Austerity at Leicester Castle Business School, and it's a great honour and pleasure for me. Today we've got three leading De Montfort University scholars who are going to deliver speed lectures, followed first by a panel discussion and then an open question and answer session with the wider audience. So please do add your questions to the chat at any point during the event. Why do we need an International Day for the Abolition of Slavery in the 21st century? Well, the sad and shocking fact is that it's still with us globally and even here around us in the UK. So our three speakers are going to talk about the history and the continuing issues that we have with slavery today. Our first lecture is going to be given by Dr Ohio Omiunu, who is Associate Professor in Law. He's going to examine the impact, whether unintended or otherwise, of slavery's historical legacies on international law and contemporary British society. He will be followed by our second speaker, Dr Laura Pajón, who is VC 2020 lecturer in law. She's going to talk about current responses to the challenge of modern slavery and how criminal investigations and multi-agency collaborations have addressed the local challenge of modern slavery in Leicester, including DMU's role in some of these collaborative endeavours. Our final speaker then will be Dave Walsh, who is Professor in Criminal Investigation. He is going to discuss whether world-leading policy developments that were introduced in the UK as recently as 2015 are now at risk of being undermined by new immigration rules from January 2021. And this is all in light of the UK's departure from the European Union in January this year, and a very likely prospect of us diverging from EU regulations from the 31st of December this year. So Dave's talk is all about the climate of uncertainty, which of course is only heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that brief introduction and without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ohio. Welcome, Ohio.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for the introduction. Thank you everyone for attending this session today as we observe the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery. This is a symbolic day in history observed annually to raise awareness of the atrocities of modern slavery. It also marks the day where the 2nd of December in 1949, when the General Assembly of the United Nations approved the Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in Persons and of the Exploitation of the Prostitution of Others. So obviously, the date we are marking today or observing today is not to be confused with other important annual events in the United Nations calendar, such as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, which is marked on August 23rd annually. And we also have the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Atlantic Slave Trade, which is marked 25th of March every year. And that is to honor the lives of those, approximately 17 million people who were experienced the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. So yeah, although we have different days, by way of introduction, although we have different days set aside annually to raise awareness about the various dimensions of eras of slavery and the fight against slavery, in reality, I believe it's difficult to compartmentalize or delineate the scope of the atrocities just solely on the basis of historical, modern. And that is not to take away or detract from the fact that it is a continuing scourge or issue. The International Labour Organization estimates that there are about 40 million people currently trapped in this very terrible, dehumanizing atrocity. And on the United Nations website today, the caption heading is "Slavery is not merely a historical relic." And that is apt and very important to note that it is not just a historical relic, but I believe that that also is the basis upon which, go to the next slide, that's the basis upon which my reflections are kind of captioned, because I am not intending to talk about the modern day slavery or the convention that was signed on the 2nd of December 1949. And the reason is that it's important to have a holistic view of the issues rather than focusing on the attempts to abolish different practices or different dimensions of the same multi-hydra-headed problem. So indeed it's not. And so there are lessons we can also learn from looking at different eras. So if we oscillate from the historical to the modern, if we also look at it from the local to the global and back and forth, we're able to see not just from one viewpoint, but multiple viewpoints and perspectives about the challenges, and more importantly, to understand why it's a problem that has persisted even till date. So, for instance, at the root or at the core of this issue of slavery or slave trade, whether modern or historical, is the fact that it's centered around a very powerful idea of the commodification of humans. And I say that because there has to be a demand to drive supply. I mean, that's the basic economics that I could give to explain this. So the existence of the demand, driven by demand, supply becomes is encouraged. And so whether in the transatlantic slave trade era, as we see in the map here, which was very prevalent between the 17th and the 20th century, or even in the current iteration of what we call or refer to as modern slavery, that complementarity of there being a demand in society, and more importantly, the fact that seeing a human being as a commodity is central to or pivotal to the practice, the problem, and also is critical to the approaches, whether legal or otherwise, in trying to address these issues. So we could move to, and also just before that, I would also want to mention, so looking at the caption there, I am not a man. Am I not a man and a brother? So this was very popular during the abolitionist movement during the transatlantic slave trade. And it's a quote by Josiah Woods. It was on potteries, on badges. And there was poems were written about it. And he asks a very pertinent question, which I believe is still relevant and still unanswered till date. Because irrespective, the demographics may have changed from the era of the transatlantic slave trade to what we have or referred to as a modern day slavery. Also, the modus operandi may have also changed. But the idea that a human being or the life of a human being is not valuable enough, or is only valuable enough to be exploited for personal and commercial gain, is an idea that hasn't changed and still needs to be addressed. And it's one of the interesting points or questions I would leave out there is, how effective is the law in being able to make these changes? Because if we move to the next slide, if we do a little bit of retrospective inquiries into how the abolitionist movement kind of played out in the era of the transatlantic slave trade, where Britain played a very pivotal role, Great Britain, you will notice that the abolitionist movement was made up of a world of reformers, individuals, diverse individuals in different facets and walks of life. And they did these things because they saw the moral wrong in the very act of slavery. But moving into the more, so we have here Elizabeth Herrick, who was from Leicester, a Quaker from Leicester, who was quite played a very significant role in the anti-slavery movement. So moving to the next slide, almost out of time. I think we'll leave most of this to the conversations. The law has faced a lot of challenges and complexities in being able to deal with this issue of slavery, whether in the historical or modern era. And this is is well captured in the efforts by the British naval forces to patrol the coast of West Africa during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, to capture slave ships and to liberate slaves. Because we see that in trying to do something which was quite noble, there were a lot of competing agendas, both political. We'll move to the next slide. Political, and also economic, that I would say hijacked the attempt, that took it away from the world of reformers into a world of finding a suitable replacement for something that was for a long time justified as acceptable because of the economic gains it brought. Now that has not changed, even though the way or the patterns of slavery have changed. And so I would leave you with this point or question or thought before I hand over to my colleague. What drives the agenda to abolish this issue of slavery? Is it a desire to reform as against the desire to transform? Because from the historical era, we didn't have a reformation, we had a transformation. There was a substitution of economies and of the commodities and the terrain within which subjugation continued to exist. So we had a movement from slavery or the transatlantic slave trade, and we moved on to an era of colonialism, imperialism, and colonialism. And I believe that these are the legacies that have continued to, should I say, scupper or hinder the ability to have an effective end to this challenge. And with that, I will leave the rest to the conversations we have afterwards. I will now pass on or hand over to my colleague, Dr. Laura Pajón, to take on the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Ohio. Thanks for your presentation, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to these speed lectures. I'm not sure if you can see my slide. Yeah, now. Can you move to the next slide? Thanks. So as Jonathan said, I'm going to be talking about the response to modern slavery crimes, specifically here in the UK, and looking at how police forces are responding to that crime, as well as which are the potential and the need to work in multi-agency when responding to that crime. Next. So the first thing that I would like to point out is that we need to understand modern slavery as a social problem, as a problem that has serious implications not only to the victims of the crime, but also that has serious implications at an economic and at a social level. Now, usually when we define the response to modern slavery, we usually say that this is very complex. Now, the reason for that is because modern slavery is the result of socioeconomic problems such as poverty, such as political conflicts, discrimination, social inequalities, lack of education. But it's also the result of a high demand for cheap goods, for cheap labor, includes for a demand for sex. Now, on top of that, modern slavery happens in the context of globalization. And one of the reasons of that is, or one of the causes of that is that very often we will find that a crime of modern slavery is committed in different countries and therefore involving different legislative, legal frameworks, as well as different definitions and understandings of what is and what is not modern slavery. Now, all of that makes the response of modern slavery very complex. And what we know is that in order to respond to modern slavery, we need a comprehensive response. Now, what I mean by comprehensive response is that is a response that looks or combats modern slavery at different levels. So from international level to the local level, a response that looks at different aspects. So it not only looks at prosecuting the offenders or investigating the crime, but it also looks at protecting the victims or tackling the demand. And finally, by a comprehensive response, I mean a response that involves different agencies. Next, please. Now, if you look at the UK response to modern slavery, there are two main turning points or important points. One of them was the publication of the Modern Slavery Strategy, and the other was the publication of the Modern Slavery Act. Now, the Modern Slavery Strategy basically set up the cross-governmental response to modern slavery, and it organized the response in what they call the 4 Ps. Prevent, which basically is about preventing people from engaging in modern slavery. Protect, which would be about safeguarding victims or protecting those vulnerable people or communities who are at risk of exploitation. Prepare, which would be about minimizing or reducing the impact of modern slavery. And finally, the pursue, which is about prosecuting offenders and disrupting the crime. Now, this response, the modern slavery response in the UK, it's meant to be comprehensive in the sense that there's no single agency that has the overall charge or the overall responsibility to respond to modern slavery. Instead, there should be different agencies involved, from police forces to Department Working Pensions, to Fire and Rescue Service, to charities, to local authorities, to even businesses. The problem is that the Modern Slavery Strategy defines or shows very well what are the responsibilities of police forces to respond to that crime, but it's not that clear what are the roles and responsibilities of other agencies when responding to modern slavery. Now, the issue with that is that we often find a heavy reliance on police forces to respond to modern slavery, not only to prosecute the offenders or to investigate that crime, but also to protect victims and to prevent the crime. So we kind of need to ask, are police forces that effective? Do they have enough resources, enough capabilities to actually be able to lead in the response within the 4 Ps? So not only for the prosecution, but also the prevention of the crime and the protection of the victims. If you can move to the next slide. So in 2017, it was published a report, which basically this report was examining and evaluating the police response to modern slavery. And it actually, in this report, they found important gaps and important challenges that police forces needed to address in order to be able to be more effective. Now, one of these important limitations was that it was found that police officers had very little, or there was a lack of understanding and awareness of modern slavery, mainly among frontline officers, which was basically translated in lack of victims being identified. And as well, when those victims were identified, sometimes they were misidentified by illegal immigrants, for example. It was also found that police forces didn't have enough resources to be able to properly respond and investigate this crime. And on top of that, it was also found that the certain police forces did not prioritize modern slavery or did not have modern slavery as one of their priorities. It was also found that issues with intelligence in terms of how this intelligence was gathered, shared, how police forces communicated, and as well as very poor risk profiles. Issues as well with victim safeguarding, and as well a point that I want to highlight, the report also found inconsistencies in how police forces were collaborating and cooperating with other agencies. Next. Now, this last point is quite important because what we know by research is that in order to have an effective modern slavery investigation and a response, we need, or police forces need to collaborate with other agencies. And actually, in one of my last studies, what I found is that police forces does not only need other agencies in order to gather intelligence, they also need other agencies to work with victims in the sense of engaging with those victims and safeguarding those victims, as well as when planning and conducting different police operations and strategies, mainly when those operations are aiming to secure the protection of the victims and the disruption of the crime. Now, the other important reason why multi-agency collaboration is critical is because what we know is that if we rely on police forces to lead the response of modern slavery, what it's gonna inevitably happen is that this response is gonna be very much focused on the prosecution of offenders. Now, in order to ensure that this response is comprehensive enough and it looks at the prosecution, at the protection, and at the prevention of the crime, we need other agencies as well to become involved. Next, please. Now, I want to say that it seems that we are moving towards the right direction. So if you look at these two maps, the map on the left, the one from 2017, it shows the number of modern slavery partnerships that were established in the UK. Now, these partnerships were very different in terms of who was in those partnerships, the aims, the purpose. What we see 2 years later is that there are more modern slavery partnerships in place, but most importantly, they are getting into much more formalized structures and they are increasing the representation of different agencies. Next. Now, just to finish, and I'm conscious I'm running out of time, I want just to present a case example here in Leicester of what is the potential and what multi-agency collaboration can actually bring. So before 2018, there was no modern slavery partnership here in Leicester. So Professor Dave Walsh and I were contacted by Leicestershire Police to set up a modern slavery partnership. And we kind of identified that some of the main gaps or issues were the lack of awareness among members of the public and professionals, as well as the problems with intelligence sharing and the risk profile. Next. So what we have done in these last 2 years, we've done a number of different raising awareness events. We've trained professionals. Members from the partnership have trained staff from their own organization. We've shared intelligence, we've shared best practice, we've identified risk areas, and as well we've done certain modern slavery joint operations. Next. Now, just to show you a bit of what we have been able to achieve, and I want to highlight that at the very beginning we had very little strategic support, and actually there was very little funding that was dedicated to the delivery plan. Still, even though those challenges, by working together and by working in multi-agency, in 2 years, we've increased by nearly 340% the number of incidents reported to Leicestershire Police. There has been an increase in victims identify and rescue. We've also seen an increase in the level of understanding and awareness of professionals. There's been an increase of networking, sense of constant communication, being able to pick up the phone and call to members from other agencies. And just to finish, as well, two important outcomes of this working together was the establishment of a task force for the garment sector, which is a risk area in the Leicester, and there are going to be imposed community engagement officers who are going to be engaging with communities at risk and building trust. And just to finalize my presentation, go next. So yeah, just to finish, I just want to point out, or the things that I like to highlight in my presentation, is that we cannot rely exclusively on police forces, and that we need other agencies to as well actively engage in this response to modern slavery crimes in order to make sure that it is comprehensive enough. So thanks a lot for the presentation, and I'm just gonna hand it over to Professor Dave Walsh.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that thought-provoking presentation, which indeed I was also feeling the same in the first presentation by Dr. Omiunu. So as the slide shows there, or will show shortly, here we go, that I'm now going to look at the next slide, please. Various areas, and those being business sector responses. I'm going to focus on business sector responses. After all, that's where most labour exploitation tends to occur, and indeed the legislation that has been recently introduced, as Professor Davies mentioned at the start of the presentations. They mentioned something about our current research, governmental responses to that research, and to various elements which are now being introduced, which lead us to future threats. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give some context here very briefly, official estimates are 10 to 13,000, but this figure has been seen as one which is vastly underwhelming the problem, and indeed the National Crime Agency cite there's much more. There are various reasons for that, not least the fact that the concealed nature of modern slavery does mean that we will never know the true figure, but it's generally accepted that it's much more than this 10 to 13,000 figure. Next slide, please. And the next click as well, please. Next 3 clicks, in fact, if you would, please. Next 3 clicks. If you stop there, thank you. Okay, so one of the first issues that I would express my concern with is the fact that these 3 graphics there, these 3 images there, are reflective of organisations operating with a good intent in the UK, showing that this is their logo, as it were. And it expresses concern, because one thing you'll see from those is that we have the idea that modern slavery involves shackles and chains, which next click, please, we know is not the case. The next click shows that, in fact, much more than physical coercion, modern slavery is characterized by psychological coercion. And that's, of course, much more difficult to identify. And if we, and in the piece of research we did in 2016 in the Midlands, we found that the important constituent in identifying modern slavery, i.e. the public, are clearly unaware of what psychological coercion looks like in terms of modern slavery. And therefore we cannot rely upon them to report modern slavery alone. Next slide, please. Okay, now it was mentioned by Professor Davies about these world-leading innovations, and certainly it mentioned again by Dr Pajón, is that in 2015 the UK introduced the Modern Slavery Act. It was seen and is, of its time, a world-leading event. What it did do is it consolidated a number of associated offences into one act. It appointed an independent anti-slavery commissioner. It provided a defence for victims compelled to commit offences. So those involved, let's say, in the county lines phenomenon, would, if they were coerced, have a line of defence rather than that of being an offender. But most importantly, in terms of this talk, it introduced a transparency in supply chain. And as you can see on the right-hand side of that slide, this transparency in supply chain was for those companies, for some reason, a 36 million figure and above a turnover of that figure, they must produce an annual statement, not a policy, although policies can be included in that statement, but one of practice. What have they done in the preceding year concerning the measurement, management and identification of modern slavery in their labour, workforce and in their supply chains? As of now, we still suspect that 25% of companies still non-compliant. That is 5 years on from the Act, 25% of companies, 1 in 4, are still not compliant, even at the most basic of levels, producing a statement. I have to say, of those 75% who have produced a statement, the great majority the statement does not provide confidence that they could either identify or manage the risk of exploitation. What we found in our research, which we conducted in 2019, the reasons when we actually contacted companies to find why they weren't complying at the very fundamental of levels, why they weren't producing a statement, that is, these are the type of responses we got. Well, is it illegal? Nobody's pushing me, so I'm not going to do anything that I'm not pushed to do. Please bear in mind that there has been no prosecution whatsoever, never mind successful or otherwise, for those companies who breach Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. And we get this very complacent and ambivalent response as well, which we just don't have modern slavery in this organisation, but we haven't checked. So next slide, please. So, not surprisingly, a few of us were asked to contribute to the independent review of the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which published its findings in 2019, and indeed was accepted by the government. That is a greater identification of businesses who are non-compliant, a register for those who are compliant, a single enforcement agency to undertake prosecutions, a personally accountable named individual in that organisation who would be prosecuted, and then who would be disbarred from acting as a director, and then minimum statutory reporting requirements. So these are very positive steps in 2019, and here we are almost into 2021, and none of that has yet been taken before Parliament. So our research, next slide please. Our research, which done with my colleague Karen Lawson, an employment lawyer in the law school, is that we examined 600 companies who had professed in the local paper to be among the top 200 companies in three counties in North Derbyshire and Leicestershire. We found 353 of those were above the 36 million threshold. We also found in 2018, 138 of those companies were non-compliant. So that's to say, whilst you're happy to be named as one of the top 200 companies in this particular county, you really don't know how much exploitation which exists in those supply chains to make you so profitable, or certainly to achieve such a turnover. By 2019, by our direct engagement and our involvement with the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, we'd reduced that figure to a handful. 7 companies in those 3 counties were now compliant at the basic levels. Not particularly well, but certainly made that first step. In 2020, we wanted to extend that research to a national snapshot. Unfortunately, we haven't engaged with those companies because, of course, the pandemic has meant that many of these companies are mothballed, or key employees are not at work, etc. But we have found 264 non-compliant companies still across the breadth of the UK. Next slide, please. 2021. What does that bring us? Well, what 2021 brings us is a threat. These good practices, this good law, the Modern Slavery Act, of bringing companies to book, in theory, may well be underdone by our new immigration points-based system, which means that, and I put in red there, that if anybody from the EU and beyond who wishes to enter the UK to work, they must have these conditions met. Must have a job offer, they must be skilled at a certain level, must be promised a certain amount of pay, and must be able to show that they can speak English to the required standard. Notwithstanding that, there's the issues of Brexit. Again, those other issues about trade agreements and how they may affect supply chains. And then, as we know, the overshadowing problem of COVID-19, and we saw in the start of the pandemic how the consumers may respond to shortfalls in certain items. Of course, in March it was toilet rolls. Okay, the next slide, please. So what else does 2021 promise us? It promises, I believe, next click, please, certain challenges. Because we know that certain sectors in industry, and I've named a few there, agricultural, construction, hospitality, social care, fishing, are traditionally reliable on unskilled seasonal workforce, hitherto on an EU workforce who are allowed to work. To make good some of that shortfall, we have 10,000 places. 60,000 are required in agriculture alone, I'm afraid. So next few clicks, please, for that. So as I say again, seasonal work scheme, obviously by the government, 10,000 places, but we know that agriculture uses 60,000 alone. We may turn, next click please, to the UK unemployed, and we know depressingly that the women more unemployed, but I have to say, if that's going to be our salvation, that might prove to be a fool's gold, largely because we know that the British worker is not interested in that type of difficult work. That's why they went overseas in the first place, one of the reasons anyway. Next click please. So these are considered to be known as high-risk areas, or those with large numbers of low-skilled or semi-skilled workers who are reliant on a substantial migrant workforce, who have been traditionally reliant. Many of whom are vulnerable, many of whom have been duped into believing that their status in the UK was illegal, even though they were EU citizens. If that's the situation in 2020, can you imagine what the exploiters will do in 2021 when they have no right to remain? I may finish with this slide, please. Next one, thank you. Relying on some of the criminological theories, it applies to corporate crime. And as you can see there in the next click, please, is that we know that some companies engage in harmful, if not illegal, harmful acts that use creative compliance and good lawyers to exploit legal loopholes. Our cohort of criminologists from the radical tradition of criminology will say that most companies are dispositioned towards law bending, if not law breaking, in the interests of maximization of profit. And whilst I may not attend to that view for all companies, I've seen some companies who are entirely ethical and have taken on, certainly with the Modern Slavery Act, lock, stock and barrel, as it were. But nevertheless, I see companies, and I see, next click please, and I see in there, and I certainly saw it again. I've seen it in my professional career, and I've certainly seen it in 2019 when we were engaging with companies. This idea that there are certain sectors which certainly are more crime prone than others, where it's believed that this is the way that business is done, and this is how we do business with business, and it means breaking the law. So there are certainly crime hotspots as it turns to corporate crime, and the justification. Next click, please. Is very next click, please. Thank you. The idea of this neutralization failure, the justifications for creating is something for overcoming this reconciling the criminal, harmful intent against their own self-esteem, as it were, or self-image, is that they justify by saying things like, well, we're doing this for the greater good. We're doing this to put food on the table of the British family. We're doing this because it's giving them a job which is much better than the one that they get back home. Well, I'd argue whether it is or not, wherever these poor slaves come from. So the next click, please, the final click. So I would conclude by saying that in terms of modern slavery and in terms of the business sector response, there has been some very good responses. But to itemize when we have 1 in 4 companies still not compliant, that there are a few bad apples, a few rotten apples, I would conclude, to use other terms, that there may be a case of rotten barrels and rotten orchards. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you, Professor Davies.
Thank you so much to the three of you for those fascinating and indeed timely presentations. We now have up to 20 minutes for you as panelists to discuss with one another the content of your presentations and questions that arise from them before we open up to a general Q&A. So I would encourage people attending the webinar to keep on adding questions and comments, and we will come to those after we've had some further deliberation amongst the panel. So I guess the question is, who wants to go first?
I'm more than happy to go first, Professor Davies, if my other two colleagues don't mind.
Please go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my real concerns, which brought me to this talk, is that there is generally a feeling within industry that those who have traditionally relied on modern slavery are both, when they are informed, are quite nervous about what 2021 will bring in terms of meeting customer demands, whilst those who whilst there is also a belief that there is this complacency or maybe just an oblivious nature of certain companies, and we certainly found this when we examined the responses to the Modern Slavery Act 4 years later, is that people were unprepared, companies were unprepared, or ill prepared for the threats posed by the new the new immigration points-based system. Now, I can see that there will be shortfalls, and the Public Accounts Committee actually do agree with me that British industry is not prepared sufficiently for the problems that this may bring. And that is aside from pandemic, and that is aside from free trade agreements or whatever agreements we enter with the EU. This is our concern, given this new immigration points-based system, which will not allow traditional workforce who we know have come to the UK to do these very important jobs in any longer. And
so
that
do
is
you
a very
feel
depressing
about this in government, Dave? Do you feel government is do you feel the government is aware or of it or reacting to those issues that you're raising in any way?
Only last night, thank you, Professor Davies. Only last night on the television was this pronouncement by the government that there will be no shortfalls. Now, that might be done to reassure and prevent panic. I'm sure that is what it is, but the sums just do not add up, and I think modern slavery, despite its predominance under the May administration, and indeed Theresa May, in her own secretary capacity, brought this law to book. I think that it slipped down the priorities, and so because I think it's been compromised by Brexit, and I think the government has been caught in a cleft stick, trying to appease one constituency. We do not want immigrants overrunning our country. That kind of rhetoric, ridiculous rhetoric, and at the same time wanting not realizing that workforce has managed to keep our shop shelves full.
Okay, thank you, Professor Walsh. Now, would Laura or Ohio like to come in on this or any other point?
Yeah. Yes, if I may. Thank you, Dave and Laura, for your presentations. Really, it gives amazing context to the fact that we still have this issue, and that even looking forward, we can't see an end in sight in terms of the fact that it could even get worse in the current climate or circumstances that we face in terms of what humanity faces at the moment. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why it's important to not kind of divorce the historical from the current realities, and also to understand how the local feeds into the global. So, for instance, I remember when we had the headlines about the garment factories in Leicester, and we need to think carefully. So there is clearly a demand for fast fashion. And even though it's unsustainable, but the brands that or companies or organizations that create the ideal or the desire to be able to get something quickly that you can wear for a night out and just move on to something else. But then the question is that we need to remember that these garments don't make themselves. This the desire, and should I say the demand for the way we consume. I mean, there's a lot of focus on climate change and sustainability with respect to the environment, but we need to also realize that the labor and the way we source, or the way the forced labor and the dehumanizing practices that these people who are responsible for producing the things that we consume has to be, we need to be aware of it. And there was a time when, because it happened, we didn't have the kind of communication and campaigns we have now, that it was happening across the Atlantic. And so how libraries in Oxford University were built, there was no realization of where the money came from. How a lot of institutions that have thrived in the United Kingdom, where the money came from. And we saw a little bit of a backlash or an eye-opener during the Black Lives Movement, in terms of having to dig into our history to understand most of these corporate structures that we have been so reliant on, that where do they and how do they get these products made. So I believe that this is a very good time to reflect and raise awareness about the complementarity of demand and supply and how it drives the issue of slavery, whether modern and even looking back in historical terms.
If I can comment, I think that here you're right on the point, and I think it's very, thanks for your comments, because I fully agree with you, and I think it's a very, you did a really good reflection in terms of the demand and who is asking for this cheap clothes or this fast fashion, and not thinking about who is behind that, or why I'm only paying like £3 for a t-shirt, or why I'm only paying £5 to get my car washed. And this is one of the things that raising awareness campaigns are trying to do, just make you think about why are you getting this for such a low price. I also think as well with what you relate about, thinking about history or how the modern slavery has been represented, which actually links with the idea of what Dave was presenting in his presentation about this, as slaves being in chains rather than, or being locked. And I think that we've created an image of modern slavery which is linked with either sex trafficking or with someone who is being exploited somewhere else, that it's not happening in our country. And I think that's the problem, because then society has a real issue when trying to see that someone who more or less look like us is actually being exploited, because exploitation, most of the cases, doesn't have like physical or something that you can see. It's more about psychological coercion, and this is way harder to pick up on. And it's also like sometimes we as a consumer doesn't really want to realize, because it would impact indirectly on our whether we getting and whether we buying and at what price we're buying things. And that's why I think that raising awareness among professionals, about members of the public, it's just critical to be able to not just identify, but as well to stop doing this justification that even Dave was pointing out about. At least here they are working. Okay, yeah, but under what conditions? Is it something that we are going to accept, that people is being or is working under these conditions that are completely dehumanizing that person, because that person is losing completely their freedom and their ability to decide and their ability to consent. And I think it's that complicated to see why people in the first place end up in that situation. And you need to go that back in terms of from they were coming from. If they are, for instance, having certain addictions or certain problems back in their countries, or even in this country, I think that makes everything very, very complicated. I think that we need to show and highlight that complexity, that it's not going to be black and white, actually.
Thank you, Laura. I think I'd like to just extend to that point, is that, again, referring to the future, is that we know that there has been an expectation of the consumer in the UK to expect things in no short supply, to expect things when they want them and at the price they want them. And my concern is that pressure by, let's say, to use the example of supermarkets, upon the suppliers to produce goods, to supply goods to the supermarket, and then in turn the consumer, set against the problems that I mentioned and others have mentioned in their talks, suggests that what we may have is companies unwittingly or otherwise engaged in modern slavery at a rate which really took me back to my professional career at the turn of the century, before the EU was widened to more countries, and I could see that happening again in order for demands to be met. Now, this introduces a new idea. Can the consumer become an agent in that in the prevention of modern slavery by making demands? Hitherto, we've not seen any. You would imagine on the face of it, we've seen it. If we're able to kite mark certain items, services, or goods with the notion that this was a slavery-free item, this would be wonderful, and I think that it would be progressive if it actually influenced consumer behavior. And I'm afraid I'm not involved in marketing, but it would be really something interesting to see whether something like that would actually influence consumer behavior. At the same time, many of the companies we found who were non-compliant with the Modern Slavery Act in 2019, 2020, even though, as I say, it's been in 4 or 5 years. Now, those companies who probably don't have a consumer, front-end individual consumer, but they probably work in industry to industry. Let's say A to Z office supplies or something of that nature. Somebody who doesn't have, who've built up a relationship with their consumer, and that relationship will not easily be removed, and the consumer, the receiving company, may feel, because of the specialist nature of that service, may feel that they haven't got the same choice as a consumer who shops weekly, let's say, or for clothes or food. Likewise, we've noticed that the problems were amongst companies whose consumers were occasional, let's say buying a car. So, for example, in those companies, they may not feel so keenly this idea that we might lose customers, because basically customers who only occasionally buy such high-priced items are more interested, I suspect, in getting a reduced price rather than concerning itself if there's any modern slavery in that supply chain, unfortunately. So how much consumers can actually change views, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure neither how much they can change views, and what I think is that they definitely have a role to play. I think that as part of the society, as part of the demand, they have a role, they can influence. I also think that we can, when we are making those arguments and those and this discussion, we can also, we need to be careful not to put all the responsibility on this demand, and not all the responsibility in the consumer, because therefore we would be taking away the responsibility of the big companies, the responsibility of the governments, the responsibility of policymakers and enforcement. So I think that I'm neither aware of fully expert in the sense of how they much can influence in terms of marketing perspective and consumer behavior. I see consumers as someone who has a role to play, as someone who can influence, and we've seen that consumers can influence and society can influence in campaigns, in movements. I also think that we need to be cautious of not putting all the blame on the consumers, because therefore I think that we would be missing the point as well of having this kind of overall response. I'm not sure what you think.
Could I just mention about that? With respect to the consumers kind of driving this awareness, and in international trade circles, so we have this concept of voluntary sustainability standards, VSS, and they've become quite popular. So things you would see like fair trade. So when you see fair trade is a symbol that is indicating that the way in which the products have been sourced, the raw materials have been sourced from, say, countries in Africa or South America, are in accordance with certain standards. And over the years, this voluntary sustainability standards have become kind of like a benchmark, because even within the WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules, they depend on voluntary standard making bodies like the International Standard Organization for putting a benchmark on what producers and suppliers in certain countries will expect of people who are producing or manufacturing certain parts or components of a particular product. But I think the problem with that is it has also become a way or a mechanism by some countries for protectionism. So it has also these created market barriers for a lot of developing countries trying to access this market. So if you don't meet the standards, you're unable to sell products or bring products in. But more importantly, I think it's back to the consumer's mindset, in that even though you might have this voluntary standards that producers in the supply chain have to meet, but if the consumers themselves are not pushing it or enforcing it, so from fair trade, right? There are what we call fair trade communities in Britain. You have about 600 fair trade communities. These are communities that have said, we will only, or we would not enforce, because it's not mandatory or backed by law, but we stand by and we support only sustainably sourced products in our stores and our supermarkets and our high streets. So having that kind of campaign or awareness and allowing it to become more widespread, even globally, would help, because sometimes there is that disconnection in the supply chain from where these products are sourced, and we do not realize what standards are being adhered to, or if these standards are being enforced over there. So, for instance, just yesterday on the news, or last year, I remember the Tesco greeting card that there was an SOS message inside of someone saying that it had been produced in a prison somewhere in China. So, and obviously, the companies always come up with this deniability. We were not aware. We were not aware this was happening. We will do some investigation into it and we'll get it sorted. Then everything blows away until the next time it is revealed again on the headlines. So essentially, Laura is right in terms of there's a lot that the role consumer has to play. But the companies, because even the corporate structures we are still working with are structures that have been in existence for centuries. And it is very, very focused on profitability over sustainability. And so labor standards tends to go lower in the ranking of priorities at the end of the day.
And thank you. I also, referring back to your first question, Professor Davies, about government intervention, I think it's worthwhile remembering, bearing in Laura's and Howie has made me remember that I've not mentioned something, of course, and that is this. I've only referred to it obliquely, that there has been no prosecution of any company by the government despite this act being in. Nobody has been prosecuted, and it will not happen until and certainly a compliance won't go up until such things like that occur. That's shameful that there's been no prosecution. No checks are very few, very rarely occurring, and so companies who are, as I say, maybe criminogenic in their approach, culture, etc., may feel that this is the Wild West.
Okay, many thanks, colleagues. I think we should now bring in some wider questions and comments. And I so far have three, and I will ask them one at a time. But colleagues, please do keep on posting additional questions if you've got them, and we will keep running through them until we run out of time. The first question is from Professor Deborah Cartmel, and it's directed to Professor Walsh, although our other two speakers might also want to comment. Has the pandemic helped or hindered the issue of modern day slavery?
Thank you, Professor Cartmel. I think it's a really good question. I see, you know, I think of the example, and I used it in somewhat humorous or attempted humor in terms of toilet rolls. We saw how that came up, and all of a sudden, and indeed it's the same with masks, of course, is that I think for many organizations, entrepreneurs, they've seen this as an opportunity to make money by supplying toilet rolls on, via various other means, and indeed masks. And I wonder, because what we do know about modern slavery is that it meets very quick needs for customer demands, very seasonal, very unskilled. Where that comes in, where there's very little training required, a need for a huge amount of work, that this is where the risks of modern slavery occur. And it occurred to me, given some of the prices at which we're being asked for these things, that maybe what was happening there is that slaves were being used. Certainly, I should imagine the necessary checks were not being made as to who was producing these goods. And it comes back to a point made by my fellow speakers. There wasn't too much by way of questions asked either. So I suspect for the pandemic, it's created yet opportunities. And don't forget, in these opportunities, that what has come to place itself in the midst of human trafficking and modern slavery is this notion of organized criminals. And one thing that organized criminals are very good at is being entrepreneurial and getting a workforce of some sort there in the right place at the right time. So I suspect the pandemic has created wonderful opportunities for organized criminals.
Would anybody else like to come in on that?
Yeah, can I just add? When we look at modern day slavery, we obviously have to think about not just trafficking and movement of persons in terms of migration patterns. We also have to look at the supply chain. I mean, we are a global supply chain where a lot of things are sourced in different locations. So just yesterday on BBC, there was a report that I think a charity set up at the Guardian newspaper had raised some money to source personal protective equipment to help out in the UK. And then it was revealed that the conditions under which the PPEs were made had all sorts of issues relating to modern day slavery. So in a way, there would be the pandemic has created a new type of demand for a new type of product, and quickly. And so therefore, the supply is still available. And the problem is that it's now happening in obscure places, far away from places from where it can be monitored during this closure or lockdowns. And obviously there is the pressure that comes in terms of the economic downturn that most of these countries are facing, where this type of products will be made in this type of conditions. And so I would say that it hasn't. It has just simply transferred the terrain or transferred the location where it's happening externally. So it's an exploitation of it, but it is still happening.
I agree.
Okay, I shall move on to our second question then. Thank you very much for the comprehensive answers to Deborah's. The next question is from Tim Hillier of the DMU Law School. This is a goodie. What is it that distinguishes modern slavery from the everyday extraction of surplus value in normal capitalist employment relations?
Did you want to take that? Here we go. And I can add on.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, that's a very brilliant question. And I think it's all about semantics and the way you label it. So whatever is deemed necessary or just or required is always given a label that is palatable, I would say. And that's why it was possible from the historical perspective that for centuries, slavery was justified, and it was in a way permissible. So the differences in time and era, and I would say the repackaging of things, determines what we call or term slavery, and what we call just the nature of the job. And this can happen in any sector or in any economy. So I would say it's a question of semantics and what we call, and that's why it's really good that the concept of modern day slavery is wide enough to encompass a lot of different scenarios depending on the context. So a lot of organizations, for instance, that were interviewed in Leicester during when it broke out about the fast fashion and the garment factories. I remember one of the interviews, and they were speaking to the proprietor of this particular factory, and he said, "Hey, this is just business, and this is me giving them opportunities, and they're working under good conditions in his estimation." But from a bird's eye point of view, we are going, "Oh no, this is slavery." But sometimes, and we also see that there are certain people who are, in terms of vulnerable groups, who get into this type of employment relations, and they know it's wrong, or they know that they're not getting a good deal, but it's the best that they can get at that point in time. It's a matter of survival. And so they don't even see that this is exploitation. They just see it's just a tough grind at work.
And I would add that, of course, modern slavery isn't just simply about being underpaid for the job or being paid less than the national minimum wage. That's wage theft. You know, modern slavery has those extra connotations on the conditions under which they're kept, the expectations of the amount of hours often unpaid, the fact that they are not properly trained, the fact that they are not properly equipped or fed. Those issues also, which are outside of normal employment relations, which are also depict modern slavery.
Yeah, I would also add this is actually what makes it complicated to identify modern slavery and prosecute modern slavery, because sometimes there's no clear line or limit on where is being paid under national minimum wage, when it's modern slavery, when it's forced labor, when it's human trafficking, and because there's no clear limits, I think that's what makes it very complicated. And on top of that, you add what Ohio was referring some workers even consenting to work under those conditions and agreeing to that. So sometimes it's very difficult to, even sometimes victims will not identify themselves as such because they don't see themselves as victims. So it makes it just even more complicated to identify where it's modern slavery or where is a work and being paid under the national minimum wage. And I think that is one of the issues that we are finding when raising the numbers of how much or what is the prevalence of slavery.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, colleagues. We have one further question, and probably time only for this question, and it's from Women's Equality Leicester. And the question is, Leicester police investigated 156 brothels between 2016 and 2018. 86% of the women in them were Romanian. Can you comment on the levels of sex trafficking and whether Brexit might affect them?
Well, I can start with this one, and you can just add if you like. Sex trafficking and sexual exploitation is another risk area here in Leicester. There's different brothels that has been investigated, and it's another area. And even though these numbers are from 2016 to 2018, my guess is that it's like there are still high numbers from 2018 till 2020. About Romanian, yes, these are like another risk population. They're a vulnerable group. Not just in Leicester, but across the UK. There's many nationals who are Romanian who are being exploited. And I think that's interesting, your question about the Brexit and how it may have affected this issue. Again, this is like a personal opinion, but my understanding is that Brexit will actually make things even worse, or potentially even worse. We know that many victims are scared because of they believe they cannot work in the UK. They are illegal immigrants. Many offenders use threats that they are going to report them to the police, and therefore they are going to be deported to their country of origin. So Brexit, and therefore making it even more difficult for people across the UK, including from Romania, to come into the UK, it may actually increase those victims that are going to engage through those organized criminal networks to enter into the UK to get some job, and they will again falsely consent or not to be exploited either in the sexual industry or in the or become exploited in the labor sector.
I would add, thank you, Laura. I think it's very, very evident that. I also add that, remember, this is supply and demand. Organised crime has really become the main drivers behind sex trafficking. They will not be put off by by what's happening in 2021. They will find, and they're adept at finding, new ways of getting materials, in this case Romanian women, into brothels in the UK, whether Leicester or elsewhere. They will find a way, because the money, the rewards, and the chances of prosecution are low. The rewards are high. Yeah,
and we also know that victims of sexual exploitation or labor keep moving across the country or just going to another country. So the issue with as well those victims is not just about identifying. It's just as well not missing those victims to prevent them to become exploited again, either somewhere else in the UK or somewhere else in Europe.
We have 4 minutes left, and I do have one final question, which is, and this is linked to Ohio's point about the links between past and present. Do you feel that there's anything that those fighting slavery today can learn from those who fought it in the past?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I think so. One of the things that I believe that the United Kingdom is renowned for is having big characters, people of who are just relentless or have a conviction and run with it. And in that era of the abolitionist movement, there were a number of really, really larger than life characters who were reformers. They didn't come with an agenda. They were focused on the challenges of this, this trade and this particular activity. And we need to see more of such people, rise up. And I think it links to what Laura said about more collaborations. We can't leave this. It's not a policing issue. We need to see more of these collaborations between charities, between people who see the wrongs of it and are ready to put in their resources, their time, and their effort to push that awareness around about what needs to change. Because that was what drove the political and legal change eventually in the historical context. So we need to see more of that now.
Thank you very much for that. Did you want to add anything, Laura?
No, that I just fully agree with what Ohio just said.
Okay, well, in that case, it's time for us to draw proceedings to a conclusion. First of all, apologies from Dave Walsh, who just had to leave for a prior engagement. But I'd like to thank all 3 speakers very, very much for their tremendously engaging presentations and conversations during the panel session and the Q&A. Thank you very much too to those who tuned in for this webinar and for making comments and questions. Without those, these events don't really happen. And we hope that you'll be able to join us for more of these in the near future. The next event we have is in the series is on the 27th of January, which is the International Day of Education. And we hope that you will be able to join us for that. There will be more information posted on the DMU website soon. That aside, it just remains for me to say thank you very, very much for joining us once more, and wish you goodbye. Goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.